Why don't you guys go ahead and do that while I am getting things going here. Now, my name is Scott Stoll. I've been dealing with Flutter since Alpha. I also have an Android developer nano degree. Does anybody here know what that means? You know, Google Udacity, nano degree, Android developer. It means I can walk into any Android shop anywhere on the planet and find the bathroom. That's right.
That's talent.
Absolutely. I know content providers.
Kind of like when you find it, you are the content provider.
Pretty much, yeah. Alrighty. 60 frames of AOT Badassery. Little quick, actually a couple things. Number one, I have a bad tendency of trying to put too much into a talk. So you're going to get a lot of information. I'm going to try to be sure that I get done in time for some questions. That's what I do poorly. Now, a little bit about this talk. Simon Lightfoot and I put this together for DroidCon London 2018. At one point when we were putting it together, I had the realization. Okay, I realized that people have been waiting to go to one of the biggest Android conferences in Europe. They bought tickets a year ahead of time to get the early bird. They've been waiting months for this. They spent money on hotels, on airfare, to come in there and find out what the latest thing in Android was, what kind of stuff they could use in their Android development, okay, what was coming up in the next Android release, and we were going to step on the stage and tell them to use something else. Whose brilliant idea was this? Okay, so we realized if we went up there and said, oh, please use our framework, it's really cool, they were going to eat us alive, spit us out, and walk out before we'd been there 15 minutes. So, 60 frames of badassery. We walked in head high, no apologies. Came straight at them like a truck, and it worked. So I've tweaked the talk a little bit to try and make it fit into 45, 50 minutes. We're going to see what happens. But that's where the title comes from, that's where the attitude comes from. So, this is not a beginner's talk. You may have never heard of Flutter, that's fine. That's not a problem. Okay? But I am assuming you know Android, you know Java, you know Swift, you know iOS, you know something. Okay? Because if you don't already know mobile, you're going to be lost real fast. So, let's get right into it. Normally, what you have over here is your Java code, and it would talk to this big empty hole right here, which is the Android SDK UI elements, your recycler view, your image view, your text view. Okay? Notice they're not there. Somebody carved a hole out and stuck it over here. The green is your app. The blue is the SDK. Now in this case, the blue is the Android SDK. Short version, what Flutter actually does, when you start it up, it begins an activity. It pulls up a surface view. Flutter says, Android, please give me a surface view. Thank you, now hold my beer. That's it. In a lot of other cross-platform solutions, I'll tell you why that's air quoted in a second, you have bridges, you have interpreted code, you have JavaScript in most, but not all. All but one that I know of is using the OEM UI. Now I'm talking about this for both Android and iOS. Now the one that doesn't use the OEM UI is WebViews, but they also do use JavaScript, which needs to be interpreted. When Flutter is compiled, there is nothing left to interpret. It is 100% ahead of time compiled ARM binary. There's no Java, no JavaScript, nothing that has to be interpreted. I want to be really clear about that. Now there was an argument for quite a while, back in Alpha, about whether or not there was a VM. This argument went on for about 4 days. And one of the problems was that the people arguing were all like 10 years of experience in some serious stuff. These were not noobs. So what happened was, after about the 4th day, they realized something. The side that was saying that there is a VM and the side that was saying that there's not a VM, they looked at each other and said, wait a minute, we're not even talking about the same thing. The side that said there was not a VM was talking about there's no interpreted code. There's no Java VM, there's nothing like a Java VM. Okay. The other side was saying that, yeah, there is a virtual machine, you can't interface with the hardware without one. They were both right. So, yes, there's a very low-level virtual machine, so if somebody says there is a virtual machine, that's probably what they're talking about. I mention it now, so if you run into this in 3, 4, 6 months, whatever. But we also use something called platform channels or method channels. Those communicate with the SDK in order to get access to your services, your Bluetooth, your camera, blah, blah, blah. All right. We use a surface view to draw OpenGL directly to a texture. And then touch events are sent back and they're handled here. Life cycle. How many of you absolutely adore the Android life cycle? How many of you love setting everything up to make sure that you don't lose your state on rotation? Oh, come on. Come on. You guys love on stop, on destroy, on create, right? Okay, I told you, I know how to find the bathroom. Things like that. Okay, life cycle. Flutter don't need no stinking life cycle, man. Batches? You don't need no batches. Okay. Now there's a little flicker. This is a v0.0.1 prototype. It's the very first one ever launched. It was launched probably August, and we've just gotten so busy no one's gotten around to doing anything else with it. So why don't you pass that around, play with it a little bit. Everywhere I go, somebody wants to take a video of it, feel free, go ahead. But yeah, and don't look at the videos. Jesus. All right. Yeah, some things you just don't want to share. If you want to play around with that code, right there, that's called smooth rotation. Now, I have tried to stupid-proof the URLs. Okay, every single time I've ever tried to idiot-proof anything in my entire life, they've always managed to come up with a better idiot. But every one of my URLs here is tinyurl.com 60 frames dash something. So here, smooth dash rotation. So I'll be hitting the water now and then, a little bit of a dry throat. With smooth rotation, you can get the code, you can play around with it. See if you can get rid of that flicker, will you? Now, how do we pull this off? We don't deal with the life cycle because we go into config changes. And you see this nice long list? If I'll stop shaking. That's what I mean by hold my beer. We're not leaving very much left for Android to handle. We've taken over orientation. We've taken over, density, screen layout, layout direction. We've taken over everything. So what ends up happening here is you have your build method, which is, you could think of it as like an on restart, sort of. But what's happening is you never go through on destroy, ever, until you close the app. Or if the memory is killed out from underneath of you, because Android can still do that to a Flutter app. It does treat it as an activity. But in a nutshell, sorry, lost my train of thought there for a moment. What's happening here is when you rotate, or every time you do a frame, it's destroying anything that has changed. If it's changed its position, if it's animating from one frame to the next, it's completely destroying. It's not mutating. And what you do is you keep your variables outside of the build method, because the build method is what rips the UI apart and rebuilds it, or what results in that. So all you have to do is keep your variables outside of it. You don't lose them. It's that easy. Now, hopefully you don't stick a whole bunch of different variables and all these different classes all over the place, and it's nice to use data models and things like that. You don't have to. Now, Dart. We've seen a lot of, how do I put this nicely, whining about Dart, sniveling. Here's the real deal with Dart, okay? One of the hiring managers we know came back and he said, we don't put Dart in the job description anymore when we're trying to find people. Because what happened is people who didn't know Dart were self-deselecting themselves, I guess. They were refusing to even put in for it because they figured they didn't have what it takes. And they realized that they can bring people up to speed on Dart in about a day and a half. It was a waste. Good candidates, people they wanted, were not applying for these jobs over something that they could fix in a day and a half. And in all seriousness, people are saying that if you focus, if you really give it a chance, you actually try, you can learn 95% of what you need to know about Dart before lunch on your first day. All right, another way of putting the same thing, it's kind of a joke. New hire and the person who's walking them through everything, right? The trainer. Trainer looks at him and says, you know, we're going to have a race. I'm going to call down to HR and tell them to get your email and your badge. And then I'm going to start teaching you Dart. And we're going to see which one finishes first. Somebody walking by ducks their head in the door, says, I got 20 bucks on Dart. It's that similar to what you've been doing before. It's really nothing. So it's open source, as you've probably all read over my head while I was babbling. It's been used internally by Google for years. Just because you haven't heard of it doesn't mean that it wasn't being used. Okay? It is used in AdWords. Think about it. If that's where you made your $100 billion in liquid assets, are you going to change that over to something that you don't think is ready for production? Seriously? So that's one of the big arguments when people say, oh, Dart's not ready, Dart's this, Dart's that. Google themselves is putting a $100 billion cash cow on the line with this thing. They think it's ready. It's good enough for me. So, class-based, strongly typed, single inheritance, mixins, blah, 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 blah. C-style syntax, interfaces, abstract classes, reified generics. One of the most important things, tree-shaking compiler. Because what's happening is Flutter's putting its own SDK into the APK. That's why we're bringing along our own UI elements. But the thing is that you've got to get rid of everything that you're not actually using, otherwise you bloat the APK like crazy. Okay? The tree shaking compiler is a big part of that. Garbage collector, one of the stars of the show. Anybody who knows much about garbage collecting usually gets really happy when they start reading this. It's Young Space Scavenger and Parallel Mark Suite. Garbage collection is nowhere near as expensive as it has been in Android. I say has been. We used to say is. In London, when I was there for DroidCon, apparently they were announcing a new garbage collector, which is really good. So I'm beginning to wonder if it's on par with this one. It just might be. But the main difference is that Flutter has been designed with the garbage collector in mind from the ground up, because what we're doing is we're constructing and destructing tens of thousands of objects a frame. These are all small objects, granted, but Flutter uses composition, not inheritance. So when you press on a button, that button is composed of a box. It's composed of a decoration that has a border. It's composed, it's Lego blocks. We're throwing all kinds of things on top. And when you change it, when you press that button, now it's changed state. You need to destroy the button, which means destroy the text that's in it, destroy everything else, and rebuild it, and now you've got to clean up all those objects. There is an article, Don't Fear the Garbage Collector, Matt Sullivan, Dev Advocate, Flutter team. You can read this. 60 frames, -garbage -collector. Okay, we're going to pick it up a little bit here on time. Creating views is expensive at times with Android. It's not the same as creating widgets. Small, immutable, configuration, yada yada. Somebody got paid by the word when they came up with this. All right, because blueprint, it's all you need to say. A widget is a blueprint. It's really that simple. So every view is being cached as an element, because what it is an element is like a mock-up you'll see in a moment. An element is a mock-up of the widget, and it gets reused anytime it can be. You know all those wonderful benefits that you get from Recycler View? We're getting it from the entire UI. Every single component in the UI is being recycled. So Recycler View is a great theory. They took it a few steps further. Now the widget, there are 3 layers to the Flutter cake. Copyright me. The widget layer, you write your code. This is where you focus on all your stuff. It's a blueprint. This is what I want it to be. This is how big I want it to be. This is what color I want it to be. Element layer. It's very simple. If it is a stateless widget that does not have a state object associated with it, all it's going to have is a type. If it does have a state associated with it, it's going to have a key. Think of a key as an instance name. It's just auto-generated. You can create a global key that's custom if you want. That's up to you. 99.9% of the time, you don't need to. So everything else gets looked up via reference. So this is like a hollow mock-up. Anybody gone to stage plays where you see a board that's painted like a house and there's nothing behind it? That's what an element is. So what happens on frame 1, you just send this straight to the render engine. On frame 2, well, we will go over that in a moment. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The render layer is what you're familiar with as views. Okay, Android and iOS don't have anything equivalent to these two. You have this. You also do mutation. We don't do mutation. That meaning, thank you. That meaning we human beings do not do mutation in Flutter. The render layer does. But you know what? That's one less thing for me to screw up and have to spend my entire weekend debugging if I'm not doing any mutation. So when this is done, it's a final product that you push right out the door. So here's the way it works. We have the widget, we create the element, we do the render layer, it renders it, that's frame 1. Now, we execute our business logic. Whatever state management system that you're working with, doesn't matter, you're just going to do your logic. And now, whenever you change something, if anything has changed, what you're going to do in your logic is you're going to call the build method of the individual thing that you're changing. In this case, let's say it's a raised button. If the state of the button if the on tap has changed, okay, then it goes through the business logic. What do I do on tap? You begin to do it. The very next frame, let's say you've got an inkwell in that button. It's going to show the small circle. Now an inkwell will show a slightly bigger circle. It'll do a circular splash. but the logic is going to go through and start to draw that circle. So then it's going to say, element, we've got a state on this button. Okay? Is it the same type? Yeah. It's a raised button, no problem. Is it the same key? No, it got a new key when it was recreated. Mark it for destruction. Okay, we mark it as dirty. We don't do anything yet, we mark it as dirty. When we go all the way down the tree and all the way back up, now we know which individual pieces need to be rebuilt. Okay. Now we tear them all apart and rebuild them. But you're only changing the things that need to be changed. And is anybody familiar with the term screen invalidation? The old invalidating a section of the screen? We don't do it. We only change the widgets. We do not invalidate a section of the screen, which is a pretty neat trick at times. So, let's see here. Next, JIT versus AOT, just in time versus ahead of time. Which way does Dart compile? Both. It also compiles the bundle build, whole different animal. Not this level of talk. When you're doing debug builds, you're going just in time compiled. What this allows you to do is to use everything like a web page. Okay? You're sitting there, you're writing your HTML, you make a change, your app is running on your device just in time compiled, so you make a change, now you hit F5 if you're doing a web page, and your web browser reloads page. Well, with Flutter you do hot reload. Hot reload just takes the change and incorporates it into the already running just-in-time compiled code. And you see the result in less than 1 second, typically. You can change text, less than a second you see it. You can change the color, you can change the border width, you can move things around, up, down, right, left, center. You can have your client hanging over this shoulder and the designer hanging over this one, saying a little left, little right, little up, little down. No, go back the other way. Can I see it in green? And you can just rock it out. It's like, okay, yeah, 4DP left, sure. Up, right, okay. Purple, yeah, sure. And you can do it. It takes rapid prototyping to a ridiculous level. Okay, now, next. Oh, I'm sorry, one thing here. We don't do Gradle rebuilds, almost ever. I say almost. There are 2 times when you really need to do Gradle rebuilds other than the first start of the day. First start of the day, nobody's getting out of it. You've got to do a Gradle build. The one time you have to do a Gradle build is when you change a plugin. If you have changed a plugin, you're going to have to shut down and restart. Nobody can get out of that. The other one is, how many times have you guys been using the new, I can't even remember what it's called now, but IntelliJ has this thing now or Android Studio has this thing where you can do, in Android, a quick reload. It actually works now.
Instant Run.
Instant Run, thank you. About 1.5 years ago, Instant Run didn't work. It works now. Works pretty darn good now. Okay, but how many times have you used Instant Run 5, 6, 10, 15 times, and then all of a sudden, maybe you started getting things on your screen that you were working with about 3 hours ago? You ever run into that? We run into it too. You got to shut down, you got to run it clean. Some things nobody can get away from. We all got to live with. To give you an idea, I do about 6 Gradle builds a day when I'm working all day. That's it. Which means there's one thing that really sucks about Flutter, and that is that you lose a lot of your excuses for coffee breaks. No more saying, oh, I'm rebuilding. No, it doesn't work. So, release builds are 100% ahead of time compiled. Machine code, ARM binary, however you want to put it. Okay? The release code is designed for 60 FPS on anything. Okay. Bad term. Anything back to an iPhone 6 or Android 16. I said 1.6, yes.
Is there 4.4?
KitKat.
KitKat, okay.
Nobody really does it though. Nobody that I know of will write for anything under 23 unless there's like no way there's going to be a security problem. But this means you can write for Africa, where a new phone costs more than a new car. Indonesia, places where people can't afford to upgrade beyond an iPhone 6, iPhone 7, Lollipop, whatever. You know, people hang on to a phone for 7, 8, 10 years down there. Nobody's writing apps for these people. They'll be happy to pay 99 cents for a new app, especially if you use the Flutter UI to make it look exactly like the newest thing. I can take an iOS 10.5 interface and stick it on an iPhone 6. You tell me that people in Kenya and Nigeria are not going to pay for that. Okay? Experiments in Cologne. Pascal Welch and another gentleman who was working with, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. They got a little crazy. They, if anybody's familiar with like World of Warcraft or something, it's called min-maxing, where you squeeze every mathematical fraction you can out of something. They were running over 120 FPS. I don't even know how they measured it. It was nuts. But they did it. Now, hot reload, as we said, stupid fast. Under a second. You change the state with your logic. You haven't changed any, you know, your car class, you changed it from blue to green. You changed the tires from Michelin to Goodyear or something. You're not going to lose a state. How many of you have been filling out forms on your app and you change something and you rebuild, and in order to debug and in order to keep developing, you had to fill out the stupid form all over again, and again, and again, and again? No problemo. Hot reload didn't change your state. It only changed, I'm sorry, it didn't change any part of the state that you didn't change. Okay. Now, hot restart, well, hot restart, almost stupid fast, 6 to 8 seconds. The difference is what hot restart does is it recompiles your Dart code. It doesn't redo a Gradle build, it just does the Dart code. However, comma, that means it has nuked your state. So you're starting over again as if, well, maybe, you know, like as if you rotated an Android app and forgot to use saved instance state. Never done that before. An interesting one here, as is already written, I'm sure you've seen. If you're doing an animation and you change your animation curve and then you do a hot reload, nothing changes. If your animation moved to the end, you change the curve on it, hot reload, your thing's still sitting there at the end. Anybody tell me why? Show of hands. Sir?
Animation state would change.
Exactly. The animation state was at the end. You didn't move it. You changed the curve type, but you didn't change the state of it because it was still sitting at the end. You've got to hot restart it to move everything back to the beginning again. Flutter is minimalist. We do not have the same type of approach as, was it the view class? I'm sorry. Anyway. Every widget only performs what it needs to. A lot of you folks familiar with the fact that all kinds of Android views can handle touch events, including ones that you really would never want to use with touch events. Not happening in Flutter. They don't, the only things that come with touch events already are like lists, buttons, other scrolling items. Other than that, they won't react to a touch. You want it to react to a touch, wrap it in a gesture detector. Done. You got it. You've got on long press, on tap, you've got swipe every direction you could possibly want at your disposal. All you got to do is wrap it in a gesture detector. It's easy. But you don't bloat your code unless you need something like that, so you don't include it. Nested view hierarchy is not a problem. Nested view hierarchy, that's not to be avoided. That's the way the whole thing's built in the first place. That's what we were talking about when you destroy all those small objects and clean them up and rebuild them. That's the whole point. And Flutter don't jank. Okay, that was supposed to be funny. I'll get rid of it. State management. Lovely. Everyone asks about this. What is the state of state management? Explain this. The state of state management is constantly changing state. It's never ending anymore. We just had a discussion on Slack this morning. I'm sitting here writing a talk going over set state, inherited widget, scope model, Redux, RxVMS, block, and there's now an implementation of React hooks. And I think I've got a handle on all this stuff, and I looked down this morning to find out what the heck is MOBX. You serious? So I actually put in Slack this morning, I said, you know what, could you guys please slow down, give the presenters at least 2 weeks to do some tutorials and write a talk about something, because at the rate things are going, my damn talk is deprecated between the airport and the venue. I haven't even finished writing the damn thing yet on the plane, and it's deprecated before I can get here. What we've got so far is what I'm going to show you. It's changing so fast and being improved so fast, it's ridiculous. Okay. First of all, we don't usually recommend set state. What set state is it's nothing but a function that you put inside of it what you want to do. The default app has set state counter plus plus inside of it, which basically means, okay, set the new state with an incremented counter. That's all it is. The problem with it is it's so simplistic, it's ridiculous. Number two, it only works inside the individual widget that it's in. And also, it will rebuild whatever children it has. Okay, but that's it. There's not a whole lot else to do with it. It's very basic. However, if your app is tiny, or if all of your variables are basically private, you can get away with this. You know, if you're not using models, okay, fine, you can use it. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not scalable at all. Now, inherited widget. Inherited widget. Inherited widget is the solution that they came up with for passing information. They used to pass information straight down the tree. Every single widget would get this, and it was like passing a letter from one person to the other, like passing that phone around the room. Okay. What inherited widget did was it would enable me to take the phone and give it directly to you, or directly to you, instead of having to feed it all the way around the room. The problem with it is that the stupid thing is so enigmatic, and they actually, the Flutter team, or someone from the Flutter team, said they have given up trying to explain it. There are some things in this world you look at and either you get it or you don't. And nothing's ever going to change. Okay? So, as we say, it could confuse Einstein and Schrodinger on their best day. However, there is one very, very important thing to know about inherited widget art. This is critical. If you understand, no explanation is necessary. If you don't understand, no explanation can help. Not kidding. Now, what do they recommend instead? Okay, Brian Egan wrote something called ScopedModel. He did this in part to get around some limitations and problems with Redux, but it implements inherited widget under the hood. Very easy to use. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Redux as it's written right there. People jumped on the Redux train really fast. Why? Well, Flutter's, you know, a whole lot like React. React uses Redux. Sure, let's do it. Oh my God. I had a client come to me saying, we want everything to be in stateless widgets. We don't want anything to change state, and we want everything to happen through Redux. And by the way, my app has got 3 screens. Brian Egan maintains the repo for Dart in Redux. He says it's usually not the answer. He's the one who wrote ScopedModel and uses it instead. Okay. Heavy, rigid, usually overkill, overcomplicates things like crazy. However, it does have its place. It's a tool, and sometimes that's the right tool for the job. You're going to see a lot in Flutter that there is no one way. There is not what we call a one true way. Okay, old Chinese proverb, there is no one true way. But it's rare that you're going to use Redux. Highly recommended is ScopedModel. Human beings can understand it. That's a plus. Brian Egan created it because who better than he to understand what Redux's shortcomings were when working in Flutter? Okay, and that's the weird part is Flutter doesn't, other ways of approaching things don't quite fit, and that's due to the reactive nature. But things that work in React don't quite fit because Flutter's not React. And it doesn't work quite the same way either. It's recommended for smaller, medium apps, and it is implementing inherited widget under the hood, but Brian understands it, so he can do that. tinyurl.com, 60 frames -ScopedModel. Wonderful article about it. Not by me, unfortunately. This is the way it works in general. First, you create a model. Let's say it's your car model. You create your let's change the paint function right there. That's fine. Now let's say you've got your app, and your app has, I don't know, let's say it has a container, which has a center, which has a blah, which has a size box. Inside of it, you've got a row. Okay, so now we're at this part of the UI. The row has 2 different children. One of them is a scope model, one of them is a container. The scope model, car model for the type, has a container as a child. This one, what can happen here is if you have the color of the car as a text string, then if it changes, this will automatically notify your scope model, which will go down here to your scope model descendant of type car model. And it will say, hey, we need to rebuild. All happens automatically. All you have to do is call this function. All this happens on its own. You don't have to lift a finger. However, comma, you can't access it here because it's not within the scope of this. Without that as a descendant, you're not going to be able to find it here. Or actually, you could put the model color here, but then when it changes, this isn't going to get notified. So your state will not update. Almost everyone puts a scope model as the root of their entire app. Not kidding. It makes it so easy, and there have been long discussions about it. It does absolutely nothing to hurt performance at all. This is considered to be the common sense way to do it. So no matter where you go, you'll still be fine. Now, can you do more than one model's data in your widget? Absolutely. Okay. When you build your widget, you give it a couple of variables. Final username is scope model of the user model. Okay, we're using the username. This one is using the counter model, scope model, for the counter value. Now when we return the text, We use both. If either one of these changes, it's going to rebuild that text. And you don't have to lift a finger to do it. All you have to do is call the function. 60 frames dash scope model. RxVMS. This was created right at the same time that Block was created for Flutter. Thomas Burkhardt created this. He is a big lover of Rx streams. He came from Xamarin. And he put all this together. It is reactive extensions, views, manager services. He does not use syncs. I have a typo. Gotta fix that. But he's using streams, he's not using syncs, he's loading directly with the controller. That's one of the biggest differences between Block and RxVMS, which tells you there's not a whole lot of differences, really. Block is using syncs. You will hear people talk about RxDart. It's a library. RxVMS is an architecture. Please don't confuse the two. Also, when you're dealing with rows and columns in Flutter, rows and columns have the same superclass. It's called Flex. The Flex works with something called a flexible that you can put in it. The flexible has a property called Flex. Don't confuse the Flex with the Flex or you're fluxed. Okay? So your Flex has a flexible. It has Flex for a value. It also has a Flex fit. I'm sorry, it also has a fit, which takes a Flex fit. Flex, flexible, Flex, fit, Flex fit. Don't screw it up. I swear I'm going to write a class that simplifies this. Anyway, Block, also recommended. Thomas said that if he'd have known that this was coming out about 4 days after he did RxVMS, he might not have bothered. I talked to him about it last week. Business logic component created by Google. It's got some quirks. The two biggest quirks really are that there's zero guidance, and we've asked Google about it, and they still don't have any guidance. There's no guidance on how big a block should be. And people say, how do I determine the scope of a block? And you get this blank look. I don't know. They're working on it. The thing is, this block has been out for probably less than 10 weeks. I told you, the state of state management is in constant change right now. Give it another 3 or 4 weeks, we'll probably start seeing Medium articles that do address these. But we have 1 minute left. Just 1 minute. So let's take a look at design patterns. MVP, MVM, MVVM, other existing patterns, they don't quite fit. They're good. People are using them. But it's kind of like walking around in shoes that are a little too tight. They're not quite right. But you can get away with it. I am really going to screw this up. Yahya Metallic, God, I hope I got that right, invented MVSP, Model View Scoped Presenter. It's basically an implementation of MVP that is using ScopedModel. It was custom designed for Flow. Quite nice, a lot of people like it. 60 frames dash MVSP, another stupid proof URL brought to you by yours truly. Questions, comments, job offers, always welcome. But really, we've got a few minutes, at least until somebody goes, well, maybe we should open the door and see if the other speaker wants to come in and set up. But questions, and if people still have questions, we can meet outside. Also, if I have to get out of the way. Yes, sir.
OpenGL there, is it all running like OpenGL 3.0? Or
I don't know particularly which one. That would be a good question for if you need help on Flutter and you go to Google Groups, you're looking for Flutter Dev, If you go on Reddit, you're looking for Flutter Dev, not Flutter. Okay, the Flutter Reddit group is about dead. Flutter Dev is where everybody's at.
They get mad if you post questions.
What, in Flutter?
What?
In Flutter?
No, Flutter Dev.
You don't?
And when I
Flutter Dev Google group? You're kidding.
No, the Google group is the Reddit, the subreddit.
Oh, well,
Because it's like
let's put it this way, okay? I don't even look at Reddit anymore. Yeah. Okay. The winner of the bird. Who gets to put him on a couch? I don't know. Somebody folded it. Somebody's being mean to me. Madhu? Madhu? There we go. There we go, sir. In fact, you know what? In this Chicago weather, take the bag. There you go. All right, I will be lingering around for at least a few minutes.